Hello, I'm Henry Bonsu, and this is Doubling Down, where every week we tackle a topic that's got you talking on social media and beyond. Joining me today are the author and blogger Richard Phillips, the journalist Tete Kofi, and the priest and cultural critic Father Frank Kelly. Thank you very much indeed for coming in, gentlemen. There is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. With these words, Donald Trump claimed the world was now a safer place after his Singapore summit with Kim Jong-un. Critics have condemned this boast as naive and premature, because even if North Korea were to dismantle its entire nuclear program, there are still enough weapons to destroy planet Earth many times over. A stockpile of around 15,000 warheads is spread between the USA, Russia, France, the UK, China, India, Pakistan and Israel. But instead of negotiating to reduce the number of these weapons, as their predecessors did, both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have launched themselves into a new arms race. While Putin says he's developing a new generation of invincible missiles, Trump has called for more usable, low-yield ones. And what of the hypocrisy of the US, who have torn up the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, yet will invest over $1 trillion in weapons of mass destruction during the next 30 years? Now, the former US Defense Secretary, William Perry, is warning that humanity is at greater risk than at any time since the Cold War. So how does the world move back from the brink, and who should make the first move? That's the key question today, one that's made more pertinent by the decision of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists to move its doomsday clock forward to 2 minutes to midnight, meaning we are a step closer to nuclear Armageddon. Now, panel, the scientists moved the clock forward this year, in January in fact, because of all the talk and rhetoric and the nuclear missile tests from North Korea last year. Richard, do you think that clock is now out of date given the summit in Singapore between Trump and Kim?
No, I don't. Frankly, I don't believe a word of what's going on as far as the Trump summit is concerned. I think it's possible that, some things will be destroyed, but I don't believe that North Korea will give up its ambitions to be a nuclear power any more than I believe anybody else is going to at the moment.
What say you, Tete?
I don't know what algorithms they use for calibrating that clock and deciding how many seconds before midnight we are. But I actually feel that because of all the nuclear weapons we've got, because of the trickiness of the relationships between different parties around the world, we're always a nanosecond away from Armageddon. Always.
So would you suggest that it should be moved forward to 30 seconds to midnight?
Oh, well, it's something like 30 seconds, and stop it there, regardless of what's happened in Korea or anywhere else in the world. We are in a tricky position, and we have been for a long time.
What about you, Frank? What do you think?
Concepts like doomsday and Armageddon are tricky insofar as they imply that in any way God could be responsible for what are actually only human strategies and human failures. But I have to say, if I was Kim, I would never give up nuclear weapons, because I would remember what happened to Saddam Hussein, what happened to Gaddafi. Nuclear weapons are the only defense which a country has against the power of a hegemon power, the United States, which are willing to enter.
So if you were so you as a man of the cloth, of a man of faith, a man of God, would suggest, if you're advising Kim, do not give up your weapons at all. Do not trust the United States. Do not trust the other nuclear powers.
I don't think Kim needs any advice or takes any advice from many men of the cloth. But in terms of realpolitik, we have had exemplary lessons from Libya, from Iraq, as to what happens to people who give up nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. They get invaded and destroyed.
Well, let's have a look at a graph which will show you the spread of nuclear weapons and who has what, because you'll see, look at the numbers there. I mean, huge. The amount of weapons, 6,800 we see there from the US. The Russians have, what is that, 7,000, Britain just 215. The big question is, how does anybody know? Because when it comes to verification and trust, that is the key question, isn't it, Richard?
Well, it is the key question, and one of the countries you mentioned, of course, was Israel, and Israel doesn't admit to having nuclear weapons, so I can't imagine how you're ever going to go around checking how many they've got. Not that I think there's any doubt they do. No, I don't believe. I mean, the problem is this, as Frank says. You know, it has. First of all, who would trust anybody in this situation? Who would trust Donald Trump's word, America's word, as he speaks for America now, given all the agreements that he's broken in the last, 18 months? I don't think there's any prospect of anybody willingly giving something up. In fact, I'm pretty sure. As sure as one can be, and this seems to make sense to me, that if we have a situation where Iran has been, developing nuclear weapons, then almost certainly it seems to me Saudi Arabia will be trying to do it. If Saudi Arabia is trying to do it, given their recent history, Qatar will be trying to do it. It's inevitable.
So by tearing up that agreement with Iran, it makes it more likely that the Iranians will think, well, we can't trust America, let's go and develop, let's enrich, and then the Saudis will. Is that how you see it, Tete?
Well, the moment one person has nuclear weapons, it becomes a domino. This thing is going to roll around the world, just as Frank said. And the lessons of history are really quite trenchant. I mean, he's listed a few that came a cropper when they got rid of their nuclear weapons. But this is the interesting thing. We sit here in the West talking about the legality, the morality of nuclear weapons and so on. The truth is we are the minority in the world. The majority of the world in the South, capital S, I'm talking so-called developing countries and so on and so forth, all believe nuclear weapons are absolutely and totally immoral. Yeah. And they're just really a way of a country, the big countries, bullying their way around the world.
That isn't quite true, is it? Because, I mean, Pakistan has them and India has them. And they are, that is part of,
But that's because of a mutual enmity across the border.
Well, it is, but it's also not just India doesn't have them just because of Pakistan. It's also, there's a situation as far as China, which is, I don't I absolutely think there's no right. I don't see what right anybody who's got them has the right to lecture anybody else about why they should have them.
All right. Gentlemen, let me stop you there because you guys have been focusing and dwelling on this because we asked you to for the purpose of this program, even though you care about it more generally. We're going to move, though, to somebody who has dedicated her life to this issue. She is Dr. Rebecca Johnson, the founding president of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last year. Dr. Johnson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, you got the prize for the ICANN's work on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. How many countries have signed it?
So far, 59 countries have signed. There's already 10 ratifications. The treaty was negotiated by the UN General Assembly under UN negotiating rules. And it was adopted almost a year ago by over 100, actually about 122 states. But the important thing to recognize is that it is attempting to create a regime that is based on all countries, all 9 that you mentioned at the beginning of this program, who actually have nuclear arsenals, having a legal mechanism to get rid of their arsenals and to join the much larger community that one of your panelists has spoken of. The vast majority of the world have defense and deterrence and, actually much better security by having no nuclear weapons themselves and by working for the disarmament of the existing nuclear armed states.
Well, Dr. Johnson, we've heard from the panel that it's all about trust, and they don't think that this summit in Singapore has moved the needle at all. And Dr. Gelly said that if he were Kim Jong-un, he wouldn't give up his nuclear weapons because of the big bullying nuclear states. And none of the other 8 states have signed your treaty, have they?
No, I don't think it is about trust, actually. And I have been working on these issues for a long time. This is actually the 3rd major treaty that I have directly worked to achieve. And the first was 30 years ago, a US-Soviet, the very first bilateral disarmament treaty that got rid of a state of art system. And there were some similarities there in that civil society right across the world, from east to west, got together and basically said, you have got to get rid of these particularly destabilizing, the cruise missiles, the Pershing, the SS-20s. And finally pushed Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev to a summit in Reykjavik, and they negotiated that they would get rid of that class of weapons. Unfortunately, they didn't get rid of all of them. They just got rid of that class with a thing called the INF Treaty. And at that time, I can remember that President Reagan talked about trust but verify. Now, what we have to have here, and what ICANN has worked for, is a treaty under international law that is negotiated by the vast majority of states, which will themselves monitor. They will both use it as legal and normative and political pressure to bring those other 9 states on board, and then use the treaty provisions to be able to monitor that they are indeed getting rid of the nuclear weapons and programs that they have. Now, that's how treaties work.
Dr. Johnson, for the moment, thank you very much. Please stay with us. I'd like to put your points to our panel. Now, Dr. Johnson has spent her working life on this. Are you persuaded to any extent, Tete, that actually it's not just about trust? Yes, verification is very, very important, but the vast majority of the world does not have nuclear weapons. The civil society wants to see this. It makes you safer by not having nuclear weapons.
See, the problem with nuclear weapons is that we haven't discussed the economic end of this. Nuclear weapons don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within an economic system. And actually, the maintenance of that economic system creates wealth for specific groups of people within it who actually have an interest in the maintenance of nuclear tension and nuclear warfare. The conflict arises that civil society, rightly in my opinion, recognises that actually, if they get any benefit from the economic benefits of maintaining this nuclear tension, they will only get a few crumbs. Which is why I said before that these 8 countries, all of which you could fit in the continent of Africa with change, are actually the minority in the world that are ruining it for everybody else. And it is understood and underpinned by the military-industrial complex, the elephant in this room, nobody's talking about, which feeds it.
What do you think, Frank, about that? And the economic interest, if you think about it, the Americans are going to spend a huge amount of money over the next 30 years developing a new generation of nuclear weapons. Over $1 trillion.
Well, first, Dr. Johnson gives us a strong moral standpoint, and I want to acknowledge her work and what her organisation does. Now, Pope Francis, also addressing the diplomatic corps in Rome, also spoke very strongly against nuclear weapons and advocating their elimination. But, you know, we go back to Stalin's question. How many divisions has the Pope? Namely, these great moral voices, moral standpoints, crop up against the system of worldwide strategic, which is based on real interest. Part of the interest, which we just had, is economic interest. But actually, I believe it's the political context, which in fact is more decisive, more determined. We need a ruler who is not just like Trump. We have someone who has vision and who has the sense of initiative.
Can you nominate anybody?
Well, I mean, funnily enough, you know, I thought Trump, before he was elected, he might have been the guy, the joker in the pack.
Yeah.
Because he's, in a way, he's the Zarathustra of the situation. Yes. He could have broken the mold. I'm afraid he has disappointed me massively.
Right.
So, God knows.
OK, we'll come back to you in a little bit. I know Richard wants to come back in. But I want to know what you make of all this. Are you sleeping safer in your beds, as President Trump said you should? Here's a taste of what you've been saying on Twitter, first of all. And Rob says, I'm sure the Nobel Prize Board will take into account that in Donald Trump's desperation to get the Nobel Peace Prize, he pulled out of the Paris Accord and is thus a threat to all living things on Earth. Oh, and he began a new nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Sigrid Fumal says, no country should have nukes, is a nice phrase, but it isn't a political position. Nuclear weapons can't be uninvented, and so long as imperialist powers have them, Others have the right to maintain deterrent arsenals to stave off the threat of genocide. Dipali says the core purpose of the NPT is to reverse the nuclear arms race, not to perpetuate the nuclear monopoly of a few countries. Denuclearization means the US and Israel too. Dr. Johnson, let me put that last comment back to you. Dipali says denuclearization should mean the US and Israel too. What's your response to that?
I absolutely agree. And that's exactly why we encouraged. Well, first of all, it's not just a moral position, although that's clearly important. This is actually a legal position. This is a treaty that says that it is actually banned to use nuclear weapons, to threaten to use them, to deploy them, to produce them, to do all of those activities. It goes beyond the Non-Proliferation Treaty that one of your tweeters mentioned, because it applies to all states equally. Now, it is up to us, as with any legal agreement, any treaty, that we have to persuade our own governments. Here in the UK, we have to persuade the UK government not to replace Trident, but in fact to join the treaty. We have Israelis and others in the Middle East working extremely hard to make sure that all of those countries also come on board this treaty.
But despite all your work, Dr. Johnson, despite all your work, the focus in the international media seems to be on North Korea and Iran. Do you think we need to shift our focus and put it back on those with the biggest arsenals, the United States and Russia? Because we used to, we don't anymore.
Yeah, we need to put the focus on all of them, because one of the things we need to understand about nuclear weapons is that a tiny fraction of those 15,000 nuclear weapons you spoke about at the beginning would be, if detonated on cities, and that cities are the targets, cities full of people like you and me and all of us and our children and grandchildren, that just a tiny fraction would create an absolute catastrophe in humanitarian, health, environmental terms. And that is why it was necessary to ban them. Now we have to sign up the countries to make sure that that ban works, but we at least now have the law to do that. Now, what we have to do is to keep the focus on all areas. So, for example, I worked with others in civil society to encourage the nuclear deal with Iran, and myself have been to Iran and talked to nuclear scientists there. About the necessity to change the program so that it could not possibly generate a nuclear weapons program. I've also been to Korea. I'm just back from a women's initiative actually crossing into the demilitarized zone, working with civil society in both South and North. We were very much encouraging Moon Jae-in to do the initiatives that led to this. This is not about Trump or about
Indeed,
him.
it's about Moon Jae-in. The big question, though, Dr. Johnson, is what is it going to take to get a new round of high-level START talks on the agenda? We all remember Reykjavik 87, Reagan and Gorbachev. But what about Trump and Putin 2018, 2019? When's that going to happen? Who needs to make the first move?
We have to understand that leaders are the ones that end up doing the negotiations and signing the documents, but they do it because political pressure is put on them from their own people, their own civil society, their own parliamentarians, and from outside the rest of the international community, the rest of the countries. This is what's happened, but we do not put our trust. We did not put our trust in Reagan and Gorbachev. We kept the pressure up to make them implement the INF Treaty back then. We're not, and we must not put our trust in these vain, in Kim and Trump, who are frankly, really problematic human beings in terms of human rights and women's rights and all sorts of other reasons. Nevertheless, I argue that if you care about the survival of the world, it is necessary to work with the leaders, such as those,
Rachel Johnson,
and to pressure them into joining.
Dr. Rebecca Johnson, thank you very much indeed for joining us, Dr. Rebecca Johnson, founding president of ICANN. Richard, you're itching to get in.
Well, I congratulate Dr. Johnson on her prize. I think she's fantastically naive. I'm sorry, but I just think this is all complete nonsense.
Really? Why?
Because I don't. Because I don't.
You think it's nonsense that the civil society in the end puts pressure on their leaders?
Absolute nonsense.
To do the work at the end?
If, first of all, for something to happen in that way, that it has to be a priority for people. It's not a priority. I guarantee if you went out and asked...
Your survival, the survival of your children, is not a priority?
No, not in terms of what people are actually thinking about today. If we had some sort of nuclear explosion and it suddenly appeared on people's television screens, then it would be a priority, just as the children locked up in the jails on the Mexican border have become a massive political priority. At the moment, no. My fundamental position, Henry, if I can just say this, last year I went to the museum in Hiroshima against my will. I didn't want to go. I was dragged along. It was absolutely incredibly impressive. Yeah. And what happened, I'll tell you one little thing in there. There is an exhibit with a tricycle, a child's tricycle, that has basically been burnt to, not quite to cinders, because you can still make it out. The story of that was a child, at the time when they dropped the bomb in Hiroshima, a 3-year-old child was cycling outside his house and was fundamentally incinerated along with the bike, although the frame of the bike still. He was then buried. The father was convinced that the child was so attached to the bike that he had to be buried with the bike. Right. And he was buried. They then disinterred the child eventually and reburied him and gave the bike to the museum. It is human stories that are going to change people's minds, and at the moment it's just not a priority.
Very, very powerful human story. I know Tete and Frank want to react, and you will in just a moment. But we want your reaction out there, because you've been venting your spleen on Facebook, and here's a taste of the opinion out there. And Hroji says, the US is the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons against human beings, resulting in the deaths of over 100,000 people. Yet its government demands the disarmament of Iran, a country with 0 nuclear warheads. Andrew says, if any other president dared to claim what Trump claims about his deal with North Korea, Trump himself would have taken to Twitter and called it an empty, toothless failure. And Joanna says, Trump apparently considers his nuclear weapons policy a component of making America great again, but we might more justifiably view it as a giant step toward catastrophe. Remember, you can always get involved in the conversation on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram by using the handle DOUBLINGDOWNTV. Tete, you wanted to come back?
See, a couple of things come to mind. What our guest was talking about, civil society, goes right to the nub of all of this discussion. The silly speak that we get. Putin calls his rockets invincible. Yeah. Okay. Then Trump has these low-yield nukes, which he calls baby nukes. We jest about things that will end the destiny of the human race. And something has happened because civil society gradually, everywhere in the world, is beginning to wake up, is beginning to become more conversant. The kind of feedback you're getting on a show like this...
I'm sorry, where's the evidence of that?
No, excuse me. The kind of evidence, the response that you're getting on shows like this tells you that actually people aren't as stupid as they look. The final point... Wait. The final point is that at the end of the day, a democracy depends on the information people have on which to vote. Whether or not they saw an absolutely shattering exhibit in the museum in Hiroshima, or they saw footage of children in cages, that's what drives democracy.
Yes.
I'm absolutely certain that's what's going to drive these people to their senses.
How much faith do you have in civil society mobilising and persuading leaders in the US, in Russia and elsewhere to do the right thing?
Well, I mean, we have to assume that what human beings do does matter, but we're not sort of, as it were, merely pushed around by deterministic forces. We have to believe our actions have consequences. So in that sense, there is a difference. But, you know, I wrote my MA dissertation in the 80s concerning the morality of nuclear deterrence, when the world was divided in two opposed camps. It was the West and it was the Soviet Union, communism, the big bogey. And there was a balance called MAD, mutual assured destruction, which was kept in place by the strategy of nuclear deterrence. People were much more aware of the possibility of a nuclear holocaust. At the same time, nobody did anything about it. The pressure of civil society came down to nothing. Today, it's even less dichotomized because there's no longer any communists,
I
which
just
actually makes me very angry. Why is it we are sort of
Each of you-
scapegoating Russia as a big bogey? Why are we scapegoating Iran? I mean, Israel
Okay.
could wipe out Iran
We're
tomorrow.
finishing
if it
briefly.
wanted.
Tete?
See, the thinking of dinosaurs, which could keep the world at peace by mad, mutually assured destruction, those days have gone. The threats are now proliferated. Plus, crucially, the rest of the world has suddenly decided, actually, you know what? Russia, China, America, you don't control my destiny, and they will look for a way of
gonna
getting
finish.
their word in.
We're going to end with that. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry about that. That's it for this week. Thanks very much to my studio guests, Richard Phillips, Tete Kofi, and Father Frank Gelly. For news of next week's topic and to get your views in early, check out Doubling Down on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Till then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.